The year is 778, and deep within the high mountain passes of the Pyrenees, a battle will be fought that would become one of the most famous and influential battles in medieval history. A battle where a small band of elite Frankish warriors would make a last stand to cover the retreat of their king's army, a battle where legends were born. We can call it the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, or more simply the Battle of Roncevaux. Our story begins in 776 when the Frankish king Charlemagne began his second invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, with the aim of converting the local inhabitants to Christianity and bringing them under Frankish rule. As he advanced into the region, he laid siege to several cities, including Pamplona, the capital of the Vascones, a collection of mountain-dwelling tribes known as the Basques. The city's governor, the Count of Barcelona, put up a fierce resistance, but after a 6-month-long siege, the Franks were victorious, and the city fell in March of 778. According to the Frankish chronicler Amhard, Charlemagne had the city walls destroyed as punishment for their resistance. But this proved to be a fatal mistake. For it was this very act that would lead to the destruction of his rear guard only months later. See, while the Frankish army was indeed victorious in subduing the city, they had suffered significant losses in the process and were now exhausted and low on supplies. So after taking some prisoners back to France with him, Charlemagne decided to return home with his army instead of continuing his campaign. And so around 4,000 men of his army set off northwards through the Pyrenees. Unfortunately, they soon found themselves pursued by a much larger force of Basque warriors seeking revenge for their fallen brethren and their destroyed city. With 20,000 strong army, the Basque king descended upon the Frankish camp at night, killing many and forcing the rest to flee. Realizing the danger they were in, Charlemagne divided his army into two, with the elite rear guard covering the retreat of the baggage train and the main army, which was full of stragglers, weak and exhausted men and women and children who had joined the army. In the hopes of plunder, Charlemagne entrusted his rear guard with the task of bringing the stragglers back into line should they try to run away again. And he placed the command of the rear guard into the hands of his most trusted general, the Duke of Brittany, Roland. The rear guard consisted of 8 companies of mounted infantry, each composed of around 100 men, totaling about 800 strong. These men were undoubtedly the best troops Charlemagne had to offer, elite warriors chosen for their skill and bravery. And leading them was Roland, one of the greatest Frankish nobles, a warrior of unmatched skill and valor, a giant of a man with flowing blonde hair and a mighty battle axe. Following behind Roland were other notable lords, such as the Count of Anjou, the Count of Poitiers, and the Count of Toulouse, as well as several others, each eager to prove himself in battle and earn the favor of their king. As the Frankish army retreated down the mountain pass, the Basque king, realizing the opportunity he had been presented with, ordered his army to close in on them, knowing that the mountainous terrain favored the defenders and that his numerically superior army could easily surround the narrow pass. While the Franks, exhausted from the long journey, hoped to reach safety without any trouble. Roland kept a sharp lookout ahead of him, knowing that his army was in grave danger. He spotted the approaching Basques and ordered the men to form a battle line across the pass, preparing for battle. The Frankish rear guard had been given no warning of the ambush, but despite their exhaustion, the men rallied to the call of battle, forming a battle line across the mouth of the pass. When the Basque king saw that the Franks had formed a line across the pass, he sounded the attack and his entire army charged forth, shouting battle cries, eager to take their revenge on those responsible for the destruction of their city. The Basque army surged forward in waves, pushing the Franks back into the pass. Now vastly outnumbered, Roland's men held firm against the onslaught, refusing to let the Basques enter the pass. Roland led the defense personally, fighting like a lion against the horde of enemies. His mighty axe flashed in the sunlight as he cut down Basque warrior after Basque warrior, inspiring his men to fight on against the seemingly endless waves of attackers. Yet despite their bravery, the Franks were slowly pushed back. The Basque warriors were utilizing the high ground to their advantage, raining arrows down onto the Franks below them. Meanwhile, their cavalry charged again and again, attempting to break through the Frankish lines. Exhaustion was starting to take its toll on the Franks, and their numbers were dwindling. But still, they refused to give up. The Frankish lords fought like men possessed, each determined to die rather than surrender. The Count of Poitiers fell, mortally wounded, but not before slaying several Basque nobles. The Count of Toulouse fought with Roland side by side covering his rear, but he too was slain. Realizing that the situation was hopeless, Roland made a final stand, rallying the remaining Frankish troops. In a last-ditch effort to break through the pass, he charged forth at the head of his men, his battle cry echoing through the mountains. But alas, it was in vain. Though the Franks broke through the center of the Basque lines, the exhausted rearguard lacked the strength to exploit their opening. And they were soon surrounded and cut down by the pursuing Basque warriors. Roland, mortally wounded, fell to the ground, his mighty axe slipping from his grasp. The last Frankish lord to fall was, of course, Roland. When the Basque king approached him, supposedly asking him to submit, to which Roland defiantly replied, "Never shall I yield to you, for even though I am alone and you have me at your mercy, I know that my lord, the king of the Franks, will avenge my death." Impressed by Roland's courage, the Basque king offered him a noble death, granting him a quick death by sword rather than a slow death by fire. But as he delivered the killing blow, apparently Roland's sword moved slightly, causing the Basque king to panic, thinking that Roland might still have the strength to draw his sword and kill him. In a blind rage and terror, the Basque king beat Roland's head in until finally ending his life. With the death of Roland and the destruction of his rear guard, the Basque king believed himself to be victorious and turned his attention to the rest of the Frankish army. But as he did, he noticed something interesting. Charlemagne, seeing the battle go poorly for the rear guard, had fled up a nearby mountain with a few courtiers. There he watched as the Basque king and his army celebrated what they believed to be their great victory, completely unaware that the Frankish king had escaped. Once the king was out of sight, Charlemagne descended the mountain and raced to safety with his courtiers. Though the exact details differ between the various sources, the fact remains that Charlemagne survived, and the Basque king was none the wiser. News of the battle quickly reached Francia, and upon hearing of the death of his loyal general, Roland, Charlemagne gathered a massive army and marched back into the Iberian Peninsula. He laid siege to the city of Pamplona once more, and after several months, forced the Basques to submit. They agreed to pay him tribute and recognize his overlordship. Although they had inflicted a devastating defeat on his army, Charlemagne chose not to press his advantage. Instead, he granted them autonomy and allowed them to keep their wealth. This led to the eventual formation of the independent kingdom of Pamplona in 905. The influence of the battle extended far beyond the battlefield. The story of the rearguard's heroic defense and the tragic death of Roland became a popular legend in northern France. Epic literary works began to appear in the 11th century, the most famous being the anonymous poem The Song of Roland. Through these stories, Roland became a model for knights and chivalry in the Middle Ages. His bravery and loyalty were held up as examples for aspiring warriors. And his death at the hands of the treacherous enemy became a symbol of the dangers that knights faced in the service of their lord. However, it should be noted that the story of the battle as told in these poems is heavily romanticized and greatly exaggerated from the historical reality. For example, the poem claims that Roland's rear guard consisted of 20,000 men instead of the actual 800. Likewise, and so, though the Frankish rear guard was ultimately defeated, their sacrifice covered the retreat of Charlemagne's main army and ensured the survival of the Frankish king. And as for Roland, his heroic last stand cemented his place in legend, making him a symbol of bravery and loyalty for knights throughout the Middle Ages. What do you think? How would you have fared in the Battle of Roncevaux? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching. We've all heard stories about valiant knights who fought fearsome dragons, rescued fair maidens from wicked wizards, and always stood on the side of good. But did you know that the legendary hero of these tales might have actually been born out of a humiliating defeat? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to look at how a small group of Basques managed to take down an elite Frankish force led by one of history's most famous warriors, and how their victory turned into the birth of a legend that helped shape the whole concept of knighthood. It was the year 778 AD and the troops of Frankish King Charlemagne were returning home after a campaign in northern Spain. It was probably a pretty good mood overall. For the past few years, Karl had been involved in a lot of fighting in this region, trying to subdue the various local kingdoms. These people called themselves the Basques, and they lived in what is today the northern part of Spain and southwestern France. They had no king like Charlemagne, but were divided into a number of independent lordships ruled by local counts. On his latest campaign, Charlemagne had managed to subdue a lot of them, though not all. And now he was having to lead a rearguard action while the rest of his army went ahead and took some much-needed R&R. That's right. Charlemagne was being ambushed. As they traveled along the Roncevaux Pass through the Pyrenees mountains, they were attacked by a coalition of Basque lords who wanted to avenge their brethren who had fallen under Charlemagne's yoke. There may have been about 3,000 Franks in the rearguard under the command of a man named Roland, who was probably the most famous Frankish warrior next to Charlemagne himself. Roland would later become famous for his role in the Battle of Roncevaux, or the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, depending on your preferred spelling. But if you want to learn more about the world's greatest warriors and the battles they fought in, then you should subscribe for more content. Roland's men were elite soldiers, probably handpicked by Charlemagne to protect his person and serve as an elite shock troop. Because of this, they were probably very confident in their ability to win any fight they got into. However, they had a big problem. They were exhausted, having marched for weeks without getting any rest. On top of that, they were marching up a mountain pass, which made them even slower and gave their Basque opponents a natural vantage point from which to attack them. In this situation, it was up to Roland to make sure that his men were protected until help could arrive. Help that never came. You see, while there are modern historians who argue that there was some sort of mix-up where Charlemagne's main force decided to stop for the night while the rearguard kept moving, most medieval sources claim that Charlemagne simply left Roland and his men to fend for themselves, ordering them to keep him safe even if it meant that they had to give up their own lives. The battle itself is known only through medieval sources, so we don't know the full details of what happened. But we do know that the attackers caught the Frankish rearguard by surprise and began picking them off one by one. We also know that Roland managed to rally his men and drive the Basques back, at least for a time. During the fight, Roland broke his sword. So, he used a hammer instead before finally succumbing to a Basque nobleman named Bellarminus, who decapitated him. And here's where the legend really begins. One version of the story claims that as Roland lay dying, he was offered a chance to convert to Basque paganism, but refused, saying that he would rather die a Christian than live in pagan lands. According to other versions, Roland died cursing the Franks who abandoned him, yelling "Treason, treason." Some versions say that as the Basques were celebrating their victory, a dove flew out of Roland's neck wound and flew up to heaven, where it transformed into Roland's soul. Then there are the numbers, because the numbers are weird. While some medieval sources claim that there were only 20 Franks left alive by the end of the day, with Roland being the last to fall, others claim that there were 40 survivors. The discrepancy can be explained by a single word in Latin, which can either mean 20 or 40. But why would anyone think that 20 people could hold off an entire army? Well, because medieval people were kind of bad at math. The truth of the matter was that whoever wrote down the accounts of the battle wanted to make a political statement. You see, as the Frankish Empire grew, it absorbed a lot of different people into its borders, and not everyone was happy about that. The Basques, for example, were definitely not fans of the new Frankish overlords. So they would have naturally glorified the Basque victory at Roncevaux and diminished the Frankish account of the battle. This isn't to say that Charlemagne didn't realize how humiliating this battle was. He held a funeral for Roland and his men and ordered a church to be built in his honor, which may or may not have happened. But the fact of the matter was, the Battle of Roncevaux was seen as a major embarrassment for the Frankish. So in order to bolster morale, they needed a miracle. Enter the Song of Roland, an epic poem written in French in the late 11th century that has become one of the cornerstones of medieval literature. The author, an otherwise unknown writer named Roland, spun a yarn about Roland's last stand that elevated his actions to near mythical status. Gone was the embarrassed rear guard that had been abandoned by their king. Instead, Roland was a loyal servant of Charlemagne who fought valiantly to cover his lord's retreat. His men weren't just common foot soldiers, but elite members of the royal court, and they fought to the death defending their king, their god, and their honor. Instead of dying cursing Charlemagne, as in some versions of the story, he met his end calling on God and his king for aid, showing his devotion to both God and his lord. And when he refused to convert to Basque paganism, he didn't do it because he was afraid. He did it to remain faithful to his Christian beliefs. In short, Roland turned a shameful defeat into a glorious victory for the forces of good. Roland and his men were martyrs who died for their faith, and Charlemagne was a great leader who had been saved by the valor of his knights. And that's where the legend of Roland was born. Over the next couple of centuries, his tale inspired countless works of art and literature, cementing the image of the brave knight in the European consciousness. This image was further cemented by Chrétien de Troyes, a poet who wrote several tales about the Knights of the Round Table and is considered one of the founders of the Arthurian legend. One of Chrétien's characters, the Knight Yvain or Yvain, was directly modeled after Roland, and many of his adventures were lifted straight from the Song of Roland. In fact, Chrétien's work is responsible for a lot of the elements we associate with knights today, including the idea that they were supposed to fight for love, honor, and glory, as well as to defend the weak and helpless. Chrétien was writing during the height of courtly love, when nobles and kings alike were trying to mold themselves after the classical heroes of Roman literature. And what better way to do that than to tell stories about the exploits of legendary knights? So just as Roland was based on real Frankish soldiers, Chrétien's knights were based on the chivalric class emerging in medieval Europe. Chivalry, by the way, originally referred to a knight's code of conduct, not just some flashy armor or weapon. It was a whole lifestyle. And those who lived by it were expected to display certain values such as valor, courtesy, and piety. In fact, these values defined a knight's entire worldview. Their actions had to be guided by a strict moral code, and they were expected to be the embodiment of virtue in everything they did. So in essence, knights were supposed to be like Roland, courageous, loyal, pious, courteous, and honorable. And nowhere was this more important than in the context of their service to their lord. A knight's first duty was to his sovereign, and he was expected to give his life for him if necessary. In fact, it was seen as an honor to die in battle, and those who did were often celebrated as heroes. That's why Roland's story was so important. His willingness to sacrifice himself for his lord set the standard for knighthood. To be a true knight, you had to be willing to follow in Roland's footsteps and die for your king and country. And while the Battle of Roncevaux Pass was likely a disaster for the Franks, it became the foundation for the heroic ideal of the knight. So thank you, Basques, for your service to medieval France. I hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, check the links below. This year marks the 1245th anniversary of one of history's most infamous battles, the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, more commonly known as the Battle of Roncevaux, where Frankish forces under the command of the legendary Roland were completely annihilated by the Basques in the Pyrenees Mountains. It is the only battle in which Charlemagne lost men, treasure, and important commanders, making it his only real defeat. It's me, and you're watching this channel. Join me today as we take a look at how and why this battle happened. What made it so disastrous for Charlemagne? And why is it still so relevant today? Let's get into it. Charlemagne needs no introduction. He was the king of the Franks from 768 to 814, the first king of the Carolingian Empire, and a man credited with laying the foundations for modern France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire. He is probably best known for his relentless campaigning across Europe, which saw him conquer much of continental Europe. From northern Spain to the Byzantine Empire. By the end of his reign, he had expanded Frankish territory from this to this. His was a truly astonishing feat and makes him one of history's greatest conquerors. During all of this campaigning, he fought hundreds of battles against various Germanic tribes, the Lombards, Avars, Saxons, and many more. But in this video, I want to focus on one in particular, one battle in Iberia against the Basques, which would become the only battle Charlemagne ever lost. In the early 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula was occupied by several different groups. In the north, we have the Basques, a people who even to this day remain elusive, speaking their own language and maintaining a strong sense of independence. To their south were the Visigoths, who controlled most of the peninsula. And in the east were the Moors, who had taken control of the southern coast after crossing the Strait of Gibraltar with their invasion of 711. These three groups were constantly fighting for land. And when a group of Visigothic nobles asked Charlemagne for help against the Moors in 777, he decided to launch a campaign into Iberia. The following year, 778, he set out with an army that may have numbered between 30 and 40,000 men. And after crossing the Pyrenees into northern Spain, began to fight the Moors. They won some initial victories, including the Battle of the River Bieto in June. But in August, they received news that another Frankish army sent to relieve them had been defeated by the combined forces of the Moors and Basques. Hearing this, Charlemagne immediately decided to return home. As the Frankish army retreated back through the Pyrenees, they sent their baggage train, which contained the treasure and supplies captured from the Spanish armies, ahead of them to wait for them in the Roncevaux Pass, a narrow gorge between two mountain peaks, which was guarded by only a small detachment of troops. The plan was for the baggage train to wait here for 3 days until the main force caught up to them, and then continue on together. What Charlemagne didn't know was that the Basque king, a certain Theo, had been tracking his army's movements and was also waiting in the pass with a large force of Basque warriors. For the Basques, these Franks were easy prey. On top of that, the Frankish rear guard, which was supposed to be protecting the baggage train, was led by Roland, one of Charlemagne's most trusted commanders, who was eager to prove himself. So despite having been warned about a possible Basque ambush in the pass, he recklessly led his men right into it. Several versions of what happened next exist, but they all agree on the main points. We know from the chronicler Einhard that the Frankish rear guard, which may have numbered between 1,500 and 3,000 men, was completely surrounded and wiped out to the last man. The chronicler Einhard doesn't even mention Roland dying in battle, which has led many to believe that he died during the battle. Although others argue that Einhard simply didn't record it because according to Frankish custom, it wouldn't have been appropriate to talk about a great warrior being killed while running away. Roland did, however, survive long enough to send a letter back to Charlemagne with the news of their defeat. And if you want to hear what happened next, well, you'll have to wait till my next video because this video is already getting too long. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. To understand why this battle was so important, we need to look at how rare a defeat it was for Charlemagne. Throughout his entire career, he won almost every battle he fought and achieved spectacular victories over the Lombards. At the River Trebia in 799 and at the Battle of the River Torto in 801. Although his victories are often overshadowed by his losses, they should not be forgotten. Despite this, the Battle of Roncevaux Pass is unique in Charlemagne's military career. It was the only time he suffered a real defeat, a battle in which he lost men, treasure and important commanders. It was also a defeat he could have easily avoided. All he had to do was listen to his generals, who warned him about the possibility of an ambush. Instead, he chose to ignore them and attacked anyway. He also made the mistake of sending his baggage train, which slowed down their retreat, allowing the Basques to catch up to them and surround them. This defeat forced Charlemagne to rethink his strategy in Spain. Even though he would continue to campaign there and retake much of the territory the Moors had taken, he would never lead an army into Spain again. Instead, he would leave the campaigns to his generals and keep his attention focused on the rest of Europe. There is some debate about how severe the loss at Roncevaux Pass was. After all, the Frankish army was between 30 and 40,000 men, but only a few hundred, perhaps 1,500 at most, were lost. The truth is, any loss of life during this period would have been considerable. And even if the number given by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, 450, is exaggerated, the numbers involved are still staggering. Furthermore, the loss of treasure and supplies, which the chroniclers tell us included gold, silver and jewels taken from the Spanish nobility, would have been a crippling blow. The importance of Roncevaux Pass can also be seen in how it has lived on in the popular imagination. As we saw earlier, the Frankish rear guard was led by Roland, one of Charlemagne's most trusted commanders. And legends surrounding his death quickly grew. Eventually, these legends took on a life of their own in the epic poem The Song of Roland, written around 1080. In this version, Roland is betrayed by a traitor in Charlemagne's court, Baldwin of Beauvais. When Roland refuses to blow his horn and sound an alarm after they are surrounded, signaling a retreat, Baldwin takes off with the imperial standard, which signals the whole army to run away. Roland angrily chases after him, but gets killed by the treacherous count. Over the years, many other poems and tales have been written about the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, which eventually turned the battle into something bigger than just a fight between the Franks and the Basques. In the epic poems, it becomes a holy war against the forces of paganism and Islam. The Song of Roland tells us that when Roland strikes the last Basque, he dies with the words, "Heaven's vengeance and that of our Lord Jesus Christ," underscoring this transformation. Today, the story of Roland and the Battle of Roncevaux remains a prominent part of French culture, standing as a symbol of courage and resistance against the enemies of France. So to conclude, the Battle of Roncevaux is significant because it was the only defeat in which Charlemagne lost men, treasure and important commanders. Any other battle in which Charlemagne suffered a loss would be remembered only as a tactical defeat, whereas Roncevaux Pass was a clear military loss with heavy casualties and material damage, which changed his strategy in Iberia and marked the only black spot in an otherwise brilliant military record. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching.